You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 200. You're listening to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sara Thomas, providing you with resources to navigate the challenges and opportunities of courageous, Christ-centered leaders.
Well, today we want to walk through the history of this podcast, the history of LeaderCast. We'll pause to ask questions about leadership along the way. But first, Sara, I can't speak for you, but I think you would do the same. You and I want to thank the people who are listening today. Thank you for being a part of this journey with us. Thank you for growing with us. Thank you for being a guest on this podcast. So, Sara, anything you need to add to that?
No, you said it. I'll say it again, though. Thank you. So, as we've done for 200 episodes, as a reminder, you can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/podcast, or go directly to the show notes page at transformingmission.org/200. And there are going to be two reasons why you're going to want to head to the show notes page that you'll learn about by the end of this episode. So this month, once again, we're still focusing on the importance of history and context in leadership. And we want to talk about the history of this podcast, but really through the lens of reflecting on your own leadership and the different contexts that we find ourselves in throughout history. So we thought that we would begin with the history of podcasting itself. So, Tim, when do you think podcasting began?
I didn't know we were going to have a quiz today, Sara. So I'm guessing it was in the early 2000s.
You're right. It was in 2004 that the word was coined, and it was in 2005 when George W. Bush was president that he became the first president to deliver his weekly address to the nation via a podcast. So that places podcasting in a little bit of history. Now, I know for many people, you haven't started listening to them until the past few years. We started this, so fast forward to 2018. Why did we start this podcast? So, Tim, why did we start this podcast?
Well, we spent a lot of time in conversation about discipleship and leadership, and all the topics that we talked about. We always came back to discipleship and leadership in the positions that we were working at the time. We were trying to find ways in which we could help people become those followers of Jesus and leaders that made a difference.
Yeah, and I think part of what I remember about our conversations, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, is we were exploring ideas and we were exploring the tensions that we were experiencing, and we wanted to share that with people that, look, as leaders, you don't have to have it all figured out. Sometimes you simply need to take the first step that you can take. And the phrase that came up over and over and over again was, we need to do a podcast about that. We need to do a podcast about that.
We said that a lot in the beginning, not even knowing that we would have a podcast, but because we were beginning to listen to podcasts, we'd say, we need to do a podcast about that.
Yeah, and it usually came from one of us had an experience and we felt the need to address it at a broader scale, or we were reading or listening to something, as you mentioned, Tim, listening to other podcasts, and we either wanted to continue that conversation or had a different perspective or took it deeper or applied it to what we were experiencing in our local context. And all of those things, we kept saying, we need to do a podcast about that.
Right. Well, it might have been, Sara, that I'm so opinionated that we just said, okay, we need to do a podcast about that.
Are you saying that you were just putting me off by saying we need to do a podcast about that?
Wasn't talking about you at all.
Okay. So throughout this episode, what we're going to do is what we just did, give you a little bit of tidbit of history, and then pose a question for you to think about your own history. So the first question is a pretty simple one. What new thing have you done as a leader in the last 3 years? Just name that for yourself and hold that in mind as we continue this conversation. So on May 8th, 2018, we dropped our first episode. We now have 238 episodes available. Some of those are bonus episodes, so that's why this is number 200 and we happen to be doing this podcast. But it really all began before that, and we alluded to it. It began with conversations.
Yeah, I'm an old guy, Sarah, so it might have been more than 6 months. It may have been a year that we talked about, not just about a podcast, but just about the things that we now talk about, because it was part of who we are and what's important. And then we began to say, well, we need to do a podcast about that.
And
but
I
that
think,
was it was 6 months or a year, right?
Yeah, it was a pretty long period of time. And at some point in there, I think I said to you, hey, listen to this. It's a podcast. I think I might have even had to say to you, here's what a podcast is. Here's how you access it. And what I remember, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, was I sent you to the Robcast with Rob Bell. And that was where some of our conversations began around what he was talking about and how we were almost having the conversation after the conversation that he brought to the table in his podcast. Am I rewriting history, or is my memory serving me correctly?
No, you're correct. That's exactly what you did. You did not infer that I didn't know what a podcast was, and you didn't infer that I was somebody old and I needed to come up to the present. But what you did do was introduce me to Robcast, and I began to listen. And I think it was out of that experience for me and what we were talking about that we continued to say, we need to make a podcast about that.
Yeah, and we would go to lunch, and there would be, when I'm eating out, it's, the napkins that are in front of me, that's what's available to write things down on. And so I don't know how many napkins I wrote down different ideas for different podcasts on, and that we were having conversations around. And I think most of the time, the initial conversation helped us to make what we were doing on the podcast even better. I don't know that we captured all of the ideas that we had conversations about, but we sure did capture a lot of them on those napkins.
We did. And not only on napkins, but you've got a notebook you carry around with you and you write down notes in those notebooks. We probably have a lot of ideas that we've not even looked at yet.
Yeah, the challenge in that one is, wait, which notebook did I write it down in?
Well, the point is that we actually had some in-depth conversation about things that were important. And we were trying to figure out, how do we get this out to other people? That was kind of what we were talking about.
Yeah. And so our question for you on this one is, how do new ideas take shape for you and become a reality? Because there was a journey that we went on to develop the podcast. And behind the scenes, then I was figuring out all of the technical pieces of how do you get out on Apple Podcasts? How do you create this RSS feed? And what is a podcast host? And all of those technical things that those of you listening to the podcast don't see at all. And I think I've now gone through 4 different editing software programs to edit the podcast, and we've recorded in different ways. So we had a great start, and then at some point we looked at one another, and it was probably me, because I tend to experience these things. I'm going to say I'm the one that names it often. There's something not right. I don't know. We need to do something different. And I never know what that is. And so we started having conversations. I don't know if we were even 100 podcasts in about let's get clearer on our focus. Discipleship was where we began, and I think we wanted to help leaders disciple others, but we recognized that our focus was taking us down different lanes. And so we pivoted more into leadership for Christ-centered leaders and topics that were related to that.
That's exactly right. As I try to think back to how we got started, I really think that when we got started, let's see if this works. Let's see if this is interesting. And then as we refined everything, and refinement meant that we were improving, we were asking the questions about clarity. And Sara, and in great respect for who you are and what you do, I think you actually listened to people who did podcasts about podcasts, and you were trying to figure out how we would best do this. And the questions always were clarity. Your message has to be clear.
Right.
And that's why we asked the question, there's something not right, because we wanted to be clear about what we were putting out.
Yes. Yeah. And in that, I remember you asking the question, what about bringing guests on? What about other people joining us? And I was the one that kept saying, we're not ready for that yet. We're not there yet. And if I'm really honest, my hesitation came from, I didn't feel that we had, and I'm being very serious when I say this, perfected. I'm laughing at the same time I'm being serious because it sounds so silly. I didn't think we had perfected the podcast to the place to invite others in. And yet we were putting it out there for anyone to listen to. So yeah, that makes total sense, right? But I wanted it to be perfect before I had to deal with another variable of technology and bringing someone in. And so you were very patient, Tim, and just kept asking, is now the time? Are we ready to invite people in? And we would talk about people and we would get excited about people, and I would go, oh, no, not yet.
Well, yeah, you would do that. You're right. But as you introduced me to more podcasts, I recognized that those hosts on those podcasts were interviewing people, and we were just talking to ourselves. That's good enough. But so we'd say, well, do we want to interview people? Now, our joke is, how many lists did we have, Sara, of names of people?
Oh, at least 1,700.
but I take that as you being patient with me, with saying, yeah, let's just make a list. And then when it was all over, you'd say, well, I got by that one. I don't have to do this yet.
And so we kept moving. I kept kicking that down the road. But at the same time, we were pivoting, we were learning from what was happening. And yeah, you're right. Going back to something you said a few minutes ago, I was listening to other people about how to do this well and what is the latest technology that we can record and make it a positive listening experience for people. Because what I kept hearing from folks is, if the sound isn't clear, people aren't going to listen. And I would listen to crappy recordings on podcasts and would only get a couple minutes in because the quality of what was recorded was so horrible. And so at some point, we talked about this too, strengths. And so my maximizer strength served us well there because I kept seeking to make it better. And that's what the maximizer strength was all about. So it was episode 138 that we did our first episode as an interview. And that episode was with Nikki Baker.
And people need to go back and listen to 138. Nikki was a great interview.
Yes, she was. At some point in this episode, Tim, I thought about asking you, what was your favorite episode? And then I couldn't even answer that question. And so that's why we're not asking it, because each one of the episodes with people that we've talked to, there has been something that has been a nugget of gold that they have shared with us. And so if you haven't listened to episode 138 on, yes, some of those episodes are just Tim and I, but a whole lot of them are interviews and conversations with other people. Go back and listen.
So how many times have I said to you, Sara, that was a great episode? And part of it, the main part of that is just what you said. There's always something from someone that we've interviewed that's just really special. And I've appreciated that.
Yeah, so have I.
But there's another part of that, and that is you are the technician on this thing. And as you've, over the time that we've been podcasting, you didn't stop listening to how you improve it. So you continue to improve it. And so just knowing the work that you put into it and the quality of the content that's being presented, I think we've got a pretty good thing here. Hey, Sara, I think we can make a podcast about that.
I think we can too. Well, yeah. And let me just say one more thing about the technology piece. I thought it was going to be way more difficult to bring a third voice in. And what I quickly realized was bringing one more person in is no different than the two of us having a conversation. Because, well, we started recording this in person in a soundproof corner of your old office, district office, before we were at 32. We now do this all remotely. And we have been since, I think, probably like episode 20 something. We've used different technology to do it remotely, but most of the recordings have been done remotely because we realized that's how we could actually get the best recording. Now it's taken some learning to get sound balanced out, but yeah, that's a whole nother story.
But part of that is because have helped to refine and you've learned, and that we found ourselves in a position of doing what we were doing, that when we entered a certain period of time, we were in the right place.
Yeah. So before we go there, let's pause and ask another question. And that question is, what pivots do you need to make right now in leadership? Maybe another question is, what have you learned from the mistakes? I call them squirrels and pivots that you've needed to make in leadership. So, Tim, continuing that line of thought around us being ready and being prepared, we don't need to remind you that a pandemic came our way in March of 2020. And we had been doing this a while. And our pivot at that point was pivoting on the topics that we were talking about to help folks through the time that we were living in. But we had this technology that we could use that other people were just learning to be able to share information and share resources with people. And that was a huge gift.
Yeah, one of the things we realized, and I think we learned by listening to others on podcasts, is that we needed to keep that through the pandemic. One of the things that was important was to keep contact with the people who are entrusted to us. So all of you who are listening to us, we needed to find a way to be in contact with you.
Right.
And we'd been doing it all along. So the podcast, as well as some other forms of media and blogging, we were able to keep contact with you and hopefully resourcing you through a very tough time that we're still living in, but hopefully coming through.
Yeah. So from March 2020 to September 2020, again, I'll go back to the technology and my own learning. Part of what I recognized in that season was the very excuse that I had been making for not inviting folks into a conversation with us to have interviews, was that we didn't have the technology and I didn't know enough about the technology. And what I quickly realized was I knew more than most people. And it was, oh, yeah, we can do this. Even if it's awkward at the beginning, we can do this because we were all stepping into using technology in a new way. And it was as awkward as all get out. And and for me, I needed that reminder of it's okay. It can be awkward sometimes. When you're just starting out, you haven't done it. So don't expect to be the expert in it. Everybody has to start somewhere. And so what a strange time to remember that and to learn that and to step into something new. But that was exactly what we did. It was in September of 2020 that we started those interviews.
Sarah, I don't know how to say it any better. I just think it's wonderful. Let me do it this way. On all the other episodes that we have, boy, I wish I had been doing this 40 plus years ago. I've learned so much, and the interaction that we have with the people who have been our guests has just been a true gift. And it all happened in the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah.
The pandemic didn't put an end to something. It actually allowed us to understand how we could actually add to, make a pivot, make it better. It worked for us in a way which I'm grateful. So
I am too. So here's our question around this one. What did you learn about yourself as a leader when the pandemic hit? And what are you learning about yourself as a leader now? Because Tim and I are continuing to learn, and we hope that you are as well. Because when we got to 2021, there was another pivot. And how we pivoted in 2021 was bringing a monthly focus with interviews and our conversations all around the question of what do courageous leaders need to know, do, or understand. And so every month we've focused in and tried to take a deeper dive on one specific topic. And as a reminder, this whole month is about history and context. And the happy accident was we happened to have episode 200 that we could pause and have this conversation with you and invite you to do a little bit of reflection. Tim, anything you want to offer about 2021?
Sarah, I think what I would say, because of what we've done today and with this and with our focus for the month, is that all of us, whether it's you or me or the people who are listening, we're living history right now. In fact, we're actually making history. And there are some who if they've read the blogs and things, have heard me say, you were created for this time in history.
You've said that just a couple of times.
Just a few times. And that's not being melodramatic. We are here right now for this purpose. And so I guess my question that I ask myself that I would want to share with others is that what are you doing that's impacting the people around you? I mean, that's history. Now, we sometimes want to call that legacy, but we can deflect legacy to money and to big things. But just the everyday relationship, the kindness that you share, the love that you offer, being the leader that you are, impacts the people around you. And you're actually making history where someone down the road is going to say, do you remember when, or do you remember who? And that really makes a difference. And if nothing else today, just think about how you're making history.
That's a good way to wrap up this episode. And our hope is that as we continue this month to explore the importance of history and context and leadership, we hope sharing the history of this podcast and the questions that we've offered to you will invite you to do some of that reflection of what are you doing right now that is impacting the people that are coming behind you? And also maybe to go back and listen to the episodes that you might have missed. Now be kind to us when you go back to the early episodes, because we've already talked about some of the things that we were learning. But the information is there and the content is all good. So we also hope you'll take a moment to reflect on your own leadership journey and the places God is showing up in this season of your life. Now here's something. If you've made it this far, 28 minutes into the podcast, we've not asked you to do in 238 episodes that are out there. And that's to go out and give us a 5-star review on Apple. And part of what that does is it helps us to show up in the podcast feed. So we'll include a link to that on the show notes page so that you can head out to Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts and give us a 5-star review. We would appreciate that as people who listen to this episode. And the other reason that you want to head to the show notes page is I'm not going to walk through again all of the questions that Tim and I asked as we were having a conversation today. There will be a separate section on the show notes page that includes the write it down, talk it out with the questions that we talked about. The other thing that you'll find on the show notes page is a list of some of our favorite podcasts. So head over to transformingmission.org/200. I usually ask this question sooner of Tim, but I'm going to ask it now. Any last words, Tim, that you want to share with our listeners?
No, I think we've made history for the day. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And thanks for being on this journey for the past 3 years of podcasting. I think about the many conversations that we have had before, during, and after podcasts. It's a gift and it's a joy. So thank you for being on this journey and putting up with me as I was like, no, I don't think so. And you just kept asking. So thank you.
I do want to say thank you. Yes. Thanks, everyone.
And remember, who you are is how you lead. Bye for now.